Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. A lot of you guys have been desperate for me to test a KTC gaming monitor, and so today it's happening. I'm testing the M27P6, which many of you have been requesting. This is a 4K mini LED LCD monitor at a pretty good price point in the US, coming in below $500 US. Like some of the other models I've been testing recently, it offers a 1152 zone local dimming backlight for true HDR, a 4K 160Hz IPS panel supporting a 1080p 320Hz dual mode, and it has display HDR 1400 certification. The panel being used here is very similar to two products we've looked at on the channel previously, the MSI 274 URDFW E16M and the AOC U27 G4XM. All three models should be price competitive, sitting in the $400 to $500 US range, though unfortunately KTC monitors do not have as wide availability as they're not available officially here in Australia. But from the sounds of things, KTC is a decently popular, budget-friendly brand in the US, so it's well worth checking out one of their products. Now I do have to put a disclaimer on this video because there's a reason I haven't tested a KTC monitor until now. Since they're not available in Australia, the best way to get one to review is reaching out to the company to organise a review sample. I've done this several times and KTC themselves have reached out to us several times, except every time we've communicated, KTC have wanted to do a paid review, which of course is not a review at all but an advertisement for the product. They wanted us to agree to influencer marketing terms, none of which we would ever agree to. We do not do paid reviews under any circumstances. All of our reviews across Monitors Unboxed and Hardware Unboxed are fully independent and are entirely our unbiased opinions. Whenever I've communicated with KTC, I've mentioned our policy against paid reviews and mentioned that I'm more than happy to proceed with a normal review, the unpaid kind. On several occasions, KTC have declined and this led nowhere. KTC wanted to essentially run advertising. I wanted an independent evaluation. After several years of this and many email chains, KTC finally agreed a few months ago to a fully independent review process with no interference whatsoever, the only sort of review we do. The reason I'm bringing this up is I have no idea what content you might have seen featuring KTC products already. There is a chance it's all paid reviews and sponsored content given how they communicated with us, which by association might brand this as a paid review as well. But I want to be crystal clear that despite how KTC might have operated previously or might still operate with other creators, this is not a paid review. You can make of that information what you wish, but it has no bearing on our review process where we are evaluating the product only, so it's not going to be mentioned beyond this point. Instead, let's take a look at the M27P6 design. This is quite an attractive monitor in terms of aesthetics, with KTC opting for a mixture of white and black plastic for the exterior surfaces. The bezels and edges around the front are all black, as is the front of the stand pillar and parts of the rear, while everything else, including the base and most of the rear panel, is white. This two-tone design, combined with a relatively minimalist aesthetic, looks great in my opinion. There's also a small amount of RGB LED lighting integrated into the KTC logo on the rear. The stand has full ergonomic adjustment including height, tilt, swivel and pivot with a good maximum height. The base is a flat rectangle which takes up a normal amount of desk space but still allows you to put items on top of it. However, it's not the most sturdy stand. There's a bit of wobble in it if you accidentally bump or knock it. Additionally, the overall construction of this monitor is pretty average. It looks decent, but the actual quality of plastic and the surface finish is very basic. Plus, there's a few seams and rough points around the design that you wouldn't get on a top-end product. I also have to criticize KTC's marketing images for this monitor. The main one on their website is incorrect in two ways. Firstly, it exaggerates the thinness of the bezels, which in reality are not as thin as this image portrays. And secondly, it makes it seem like there is an LED ring around the stand connection, which there isn't. The bezel issue is consistent across a lot of their marketing, but the LED ring on the rear is only seen in that first image. The other images don't show it, so a bit weird there, and I'd like to see more accurate product photos. The port selection is excellent with one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, two HDMI 2.1, 48 gigabits per second ports, and a USB-C supporting DP Alt mode and 65 watts of power delivery. Additionally, there's a 2-port USB 3.0 hub, an audio jack, and KVM switch support. This puts this KTC model in line with the MSI E16M, the only difference being the MSI model supports 98 watts of power delivery over USB-C. The AOC variant does not have a USB-C input at all. In terms of refresh rate capabilities, both the DisplayPort and HDMI connectors support the full 10-bit 4K at 160Hz. However, DSC cannot be disabled in the OSD. There's a 120Hz mode for consoles and variable refresh support with both types of input. KTC use a directional toggle for navigating the OSD, which is found on the rear panel. It's a fast interface, though navigation does take a bit of getting used to as you push the button in to bring up the OSD, but all other selections are made by pushing the stick to the right. There's a good feature set included here. We're getting a standard range of color settings, some gaming specific features like a crosshair, FPS counter, timer and shadow boosting controls, and firmware updates are supported over USB. Like most IPS LCDs, the M27P6 uses a standard matte screen coating. It does a great job of diffusing light and preventing direct mirror-like reflections, so this monitor can easily be used in a wide range of environments. It does have some coating grain of course, so the clarity isn't as good as a glossy finish, but if you've used an LCD before, you'll be quite familiar with what is on offer here. If you're looking at this monitor as an OLED alternative, you'll be happy to know that this screen will not burn in over time. It also has excellent text quality thanks to its use of a standard RGB striped subpixel layout. However, equivalent 27-inch 4K QD OLEDs also have great text quality, so at this sort of size and resolution, LCD is not a major advantage in text rendering, but for productivity use in general, LCDs are absolutely better, as you won't need to worry about static apps burning in the screen. Let's move now into looking at response time performance in the main 4K mode at up to 160Hz. There are 5 overdrive settings, the first of which is off, which shows native panel performance to be around 10 milliseconds with no overshoot, though this level of speed is unimpressive for 160Hz gaming. The standard mode is a big improvement, and given that overdrive off is the default, I would at least recommend people switch over to standard. This improves the average response time to 6.6 milliseconds and significantly improves cumulative deviation without showing overshoot artifacts. It also has good refresh compliance for 160Hz. The advanced mode is a faster version with more overshoot, though in general it looks similar to standard, just with a small amount of ghosting replaced with a small amount of inverse ghosting. The ultra-fast mode is not usable at 160Hz with far too much overshoot. Then we get to the last mode, which is labeled Dynamic Overdrive. This would imply some form of variable overdrive, though in my testing it doesn't fully work. How variable overdrive should work is that it should modify the level of overdrive in real time based on the current refresh rate, dialing back the level of overdrive if the monitor, in a variable refresh configuration, starts running at lower refresh rates like 60Hz, or boosting overdrive if the refresh rate increases. This is not how the M27P6 operates in the dynamic overdrive mode. Instead, what this mode appears to do is it sets a level of overdrive based on an initial detected refresh rate. So rather than varying in real time, it will only adjust overdrive if you change the fixed refresh rate in the OS, for example, setting the monitor to 60Hz instead of 160Hz, or if you enable dynamic overdrive when the monitor is at a certain refresh rate. An example of that would be setting the monitor to 160Hz, playing a game at 80Hz using adaptive sync, then while the monitor is at 80Hz, switching the overdrive setting to dynamic overdrive. This will set the overdrive level based on that 80Hz refresh rate. But if the refresh rate changes after that to say 120Hz, the overdrive will stay at the level tuned for 80Hz. In practice, what this means is that if you enable dynamic overdrive and don't touch the setting and set the monitor to 160Hz in the desktop, you'll pretty much always get overdrive tuned for 160Hz regardless of the refresh rate the monitor is actually at. This is why in our testing, dynamic overdrive performs exactly the same as the advanced setting. It chooses to use advanced level overdrive at 160Hz, and then as we lower the refresh rate throughout testing, it keeps this level and we end up seeing quite a lot of ghosting at 60Hz. This would be the same experience as firing up your PC, browsing Steam at 160Hz, then loading into a game that runs at 60 FPS. Dynamic overdrive will keep the overdrive level as if you were playing at 160Hz, even if the display is actually at 60Hz and you'll see artifacts. But if you manually change the monitor into the 60Hz mode, dynamic overdrive is much less aggressive, and this monitor becomes slower with no visible overshoot. Basically, in most real-world configurations, the M27P6 will not actually give you variable overdrive, so I don't recommend using the dynamic overdrive setting because this mode shows a lot of inverse ghosting at lower refresh rates. Instead, I'd recommend using the standard setting at all refresh rates in the 4K mode, which is great at 160Hz, decent at 60Hz, and gets close to offering a single overdrive mode experience. This is actually a better result for variable refresh gamers than the MSI or AOC variants, despite variable overdrive not working. This particular fixed overdrive mode is just better tuned overall. Compared to other monitors, the M27P6 is a little slower at 4K 160Hz than some other 27-inch 4K IPS LCDs, but it does so at a lower level of overshoot than the MSI E16M and AOC U27G4XM, putting it more in line with LCDs that don't have mini LED backlights, such as the Gigabyte M27U. Then we look at cumulative deviation at 160Hz, which measures the bounce between speed and overshoot. The M27P6 is not far off the top picks. The U27G4XM is a little better tuned for 160Hz gaming than the M27P6, but only by 12%, which is difficult to notice in practice. And in general, this KTC monitor is within the standard range for IPS LCDs. On average, for variable refresh rate gaming, this is where the KTC model shines. It offers around 6 milliseconds on average using the standard mode, which is faster than the U27G4XM, while presenting with manageable overshoot. It's also a little slower than the MSI E16M, but with much less overshoot, which on that monitor is especially noticeable at 60Hz unless you change the overdrive setting. So, in average cumulative deviation, the result is the M27P6 offering a similar experience to the AOC model, just a 3% difference between these products. The KTC a little better bounced for the middle of the refresh range, the AOC model more biased to the high end. The KTC model is 10% ahead of the E16M and overall has a better bounce given the range of usable refresh rates is wider without the need to change settings. At a fixed 120Hz, the M27P6 delivers typical performance in the middle of the chart, with many competitors also offering around 6 milliseconds of speed. At 60Hz, the best configuration has a little more overshoot than normal, but is also offering a good level of speed. The M27P6 is a dual mode monitor, so it can be switched over to run in a 1080p 320Hz configuration via the OSD. Unlike other models I've tested, there is no quick shortcut for dual mode. You have to navigate to the setting in the OSD menu to switch across, but when you do find the setting, switching is a seamless process that retains full feature compatibility. You can still use HDR, adaptive sync, and other features in the 1080p mode. The switching process takes about 5 seconds and appears to your PC as a different display, so games that default to the maximum refresh rate will not force the display into the 1080p mode when you don't want it. All setting choices are retained across the two modes, so if you change the brightness or response time settings in the 4K mode, they will also change in the 1080p mode. This is handy for color correction, but not as ideal for response time settings, where a different mode is optimal at 320Hz compared to 160Hz. It would have been nice to have the option to decouple the settings. Image quality at 1080p is decent, though blurrier than at 4K because we're using a non-native resolution. The panel doesn't use integer scaling, but the scaling implementation is better than I've seen on some dual mode W OLEDs, which can look pretty fuzzy at 1080p. I wouldn't recommend this mode for productivity work, but it's perfectly fine for its intended use case of competitive gaming. At 1080p, response time tuning is identical to at 4K, so if you use the standard overdrive setting at 1080p 160Hz, you'll get the same results as at 4K 160Hz. The interesting things to look at are, of course, the higher refresh rates. Now, if you were using the optimal standard mode at 4K, this mode is not amazing at 320Hz, providing just 9 milliseconds of speed, which is far too slow for 320Hz gaming. Dynamic overdrive is not amazing either, opting to deliver just 7.4 milliseconds of speed. Ultimately, the best configuration for 320Hz gaming is to switch up to the ultra-fast setting. This provides a 5.3 millisecond average, manageable overshoot, and it just sneaks across the line for OK refresh compliance. This is decent performance, but as we're using the highest overdrive setting, performance does fall away quickly at lower refresh rates. At and below 200Hz, there's noticeable inverse ghosting artifacts, so the 1080p configuration does not offer a single overdrive mode experience and is best used at the absolute highest refresh rates. With this level of response time tuning at 1080p 320Hz, this mode is clearer than at 4K 160Hz, so for competitive gamers playing at high frame rates, it offers benefits. It's not the best implementation, but it's far from a gimmick as it does offer superior clarity, better smoothness, and lower input lag. Plus, the 1080p resolution it drops to is still fine for fast-paced games. KTC offer a backlight strobing setting called MPRT, which is available in both the 4K and 1080p modes. To enable it, you must disable adaptive sync, and it works at refresh rates at 120Hz or higher. There's no control over strobe timing or length, and it disables brightness control, so it's a basic implementation. This mode does increase clarity compared to not using it, provided you are gaming at a fixed frame rate that matches the refresh rate. Both the 4K and 1080p modes have improved clarity, with some strobe crosstalk, and this crosstalk is more noticeable at 320Hz than at 160Hz. The clarity offered here is similar to the MSI model, but it's also quite dim, producing just 75 nits of brightness and no option to increase this. Input latency in the SDR mode is very good, with a processing delay of just 0.2 milliseconds and a sub 1 millisecond delay in the 60Hz mode as well. Total lag, including the response time, is weaker than OLEDs of course, but the combination of processing delay and refresh delay is in line with similar 160Hz 4K monitors. In the HDR mode, input latency suffers due to the use of a zone backlight, which needs to process the input signal before deciding what the zones will do. This leads to around 10 milliseconds of processing delay, which is not ideal, but as you can see from other mini LED monitors in the chart, it's a pretty typical issue with LCDs for HDR gaming. Power consumption is standard, no real issues here. Unlike with other mini LED monitors, consumption is a bit higher than the most efficient edge-lit panels. In games, the display has about the same level of power usage as an OLED. The M27P6 is a quantum dot enhanced LCD panel, so it has a high color gamut. I recorded 98.6% DCI-P3 coverage, and total Rec 2020 coverage came in at 81.2%, so not quite at the top of the chart, but still a really good result that rivals OLEDs of today. Factory performance is pretty good. By default, the M27P6 has its local dimming setting set to auto, which disables dimming in the SDR mode. This is the best way to use this panel for desktop apps as it prevents haloing. Outside of this, grayscale performance is okay, with very good adherence to 2.2 gamma, but the color temperature has a somewhat cold tone as it's above 7000K. On top of this, in the default state, we do see oversaturation when viewing SDR content as everything is expanded up to fill the wide gamut, like we see on many other monitors. And compared to other monitors, factory performance is right in the middle of the charts, so it's average overall. Not great, not terrible. If you enable Windows 11 auto color management, performance improves as we get OS level sRGB gamut emulation. However, the color primaries reported to the OS are a little higher than sRGB, so we don't get the best saturation results. It's better than the default configuration though, and it reduces oversaturation when viewing SDR content like YouTube videos. The other option is switching over to the sRGB mode, but this configuration has a major issue in that for some reason it makes grayscale performance worse, with both gamma and color temperature affected. Not sure why this is the case, although gamut emulation in this configuration is very good, significantly reducing oversaturation and giving us a more natural presentation. What this means is when we compare the M27P6 results to other monitors using their sRGB modes, the results are not amazing. Most notably, this configuration performs much worse than the AOC U27G4XM, which has a nicely calibrated mode. The good news is that KTC's sRGB mode doesn't lock every setting in the OSD. It locks some, but not crucial controls like white balance, so the sRGB mode can be partially fixed. The gamma side of things is difficult to adjust without a full calibration, but a few tweaks can correct white balance while maintaining sRGB emulation. This gets us into a decent ballpark for calibration, although the included modes by default do not meet our standards for proper factory calibration. Performing a full calibration using CalMan improves things further, and the panel hardware here is well suited to calibration, being an IPS LCD with a very wide gamut. Maximum brightness in the SDR mode is outstanding. At 725 nits, this is one of the brightest LCDs I've tested, and for most people this is more than enough usable brightness for indoor conditions. Minimum brightness is okay at 57 nits, but not overly impressive. The M27P6 has a typical native contrast ratio for an IPS LCD of 1114:1, so nothing special is being done in the LCD layer to improve contrast, and overall performance is basically identical to the E16M and U27G4XM. This is an underwhelming result compared to other display types, especially VA LCDs and OLEDs, and it does matter given you don't generally want to use dimming in desktop apps due to haloing. This number does improve in HDR content though, which we'll explore shortly. Viewing angles are a typical IPS LCD experience, which is to say they are good and you won't have issues with gamma or saturation shift at off angles, something that can be a problem on VA LCDs with mini LED backlights. Uniformity is also pretty good, especially in the central section. There's no brightness uniformity setting like on the MSI model, and overall uniformity was slightly worse than the similar AOC and MSI models, but not by heaps, and this is probably a case of panel variance. Mini LED LCD with full array local dimming is a good technology for HDR as it has the capacity to enhance contrast and brightness above what a typical SDR LCD is capable of. It's not as immediately well suited for HDR as OLED, as zoned LCDs require more extensive tuning, but if the hardware capabilities and firmware tuning come together nicely, these mini LED panels can produce outstanding HDR. The level of contrast and control that a mini LED panel can achieve is tightly linked to its native contrast ratio and amount of dimming zones. In the case of the M27P6, we're looking at a 1152 zone backlight, meaning each zone is responsible for about 7200 pixels, a decent number of zones. But the native contrast of the panel is just 1100 to 1, meaning each of these zones needs to do more work, as in more adjustments to the backlight level, to achieve high contrast. Typically for an IPS LCD, we need more backlight zones to compensate for its low native contrast relative to a VA LCD, a technology with a higher native contrast. The combination of both elements, contrast and zones, is somewhere around the average mark here. With zoned LCDs, there's always a question of how the panel handles small bright elements, especially elements smaller than a backlight zone or that span multiple zones. There's two main methods to deal with this, which I like to think of as highlight biased and shadow biased dimming. Highlight biased dimming attempts to show the brightest objects at full brightness, even when the object is small and even if this causes haloing and elevated blacks around those objects. Shadow biased dimming attempts to preserve black levels and shadows within the zone by dimming the brightest elements. LCD manufacturers can choose the degree to which either method is used and in what circumstances, so you can think of it like a spectrum. The KTC M27P6 uses a balanced approach between these two methods, so we neither get full shadow bias dimming nor full highlight bias dimming. Throughout this review, we've compared this KTC monitor to similar models from AOC and MSI. Those products are more in the shadow bias dimming camp. In comparison, the M27P6 has brighter highlights but more blooming, as this display favors brightness over contrast to a greater degree. Unlike the MSI model with its halo dimming setting, there's also no user control over how the dimming algorithm operates. While the M27P6 favors brightness more than other models, the display still has great control where bright highlights and dark shadows can be shown on screen at the same time. The zones are small enough that relatively tight dimming is available around most elements, and it's only in some circumstances where blooming is visible. You don't see large sections of the screen displaying elevated blacks like you get with edge-lit dim panels, and across most content this screen looks great, with a high contrast ratio and rich shadows. When LCD screens push brightness higher for small elements, this can have negative effects while gaming. Bright objects transitioning between zones can cause a flicker-like effect as zones noticeably activate and deactivate. But because the M27P6 doesn't use full highlight bias dimming, this isn't a huge issue on this display. The smallest bright elements are still somewhat dimmed, and this helps to prevent the most obvious forms of flicker. The backlight is also relatively fast, responsive, and smooth in the way it handles activation, so in that sense it's nicely tuned for the faster pace of gaming. Opting for a more highlight-biased approach does have some drawbacks though. While brightness for smaller elements is typically decent, smaller elements are more likely to cause blooming, and this can be visible in some scenes. The biggest culprit tends to be subtitles or text on screen. If this text is bright, you'll see blooming around it. In letterbox content, if there are bright objects along the edge of the image, blooming can spill over into the black bars. It really depends on the content as to whether this is a problem, but in general it's mostly likely to be visible when there is a small bright object surrounded by an otherwise dark scene. The two settings that control HDR on the M27P6 are the HDR setting and the local dimming setting. With local dimming, whatever setting you choose is used for both the SDR and HDR modes, which makes auto the only viable option. This setting disables local dimming for SDR and uses the equivalent of the high setting for HDR. It's lucky that high/auto is also optimal for HDR. You probably wouldn't want to use the other settings as they raise blacks and reduce contrast, in addition to enabling local dimming in the SDR mode. The HDR setting controls EOTF performance. The default VESA display HDR setting has the best tracking while maintaining a high level of brightness, and you'll see similar results in the HDR cinema mode. However, if you choose to use HDR game, brightness is reduced both in terms of peak levels and across all content, so it's not a recommended setting as it makes content look quite a bit dimmer. The HDR 600 mode is even worse in this regard, so I just leave it on the display HDR setting. In this best configuration, display HDR plus auto local dimming, the M27P6 has pretty good EOTF tracking and brightness performance. In darker, lower APL scenes, we see decent results and only slightly dimmer than accurate midtones. However, white balance is a little cold. Tracking is better with a 10% window and white balance is better here too. When we look at bright scene performance, tracking is again decent, though shadow detail within a bright scene is raised, and this could be due to how the dimming algorithm works, favoring brightness over contrast. Color performance is good and reasonably accurate with no saturation issues either way. In synthetic brightness tests, the M27P6 puts up stunning numbers. This screen is capable of over 1600 nits of full screen brightness, which can be sustained for a decent amount of time. Now, it does technically start to dim the screen after a couple of minutes, eventually hitting 800 nits after a long time, but this won't typically affect real-world content, so we're showing the full 1656 nit level in this chart. 10% window brightness is very good at 1533 nits, and 2% window brightness is good for an LCD at around 1100 nits. This is closer to OLEDs than the other tests, beaten by the latest 4th Gen W OLEDs, but still a high result, all things considered. When comparing brightness versus window size to some similar products, as well as the brightest OLED we've tested, the M27P6 comes out on top. This KTC model is typically a little brighter than the MSI model and much brighter than the AOC. At a 50% window, the M27P6 hits nearly 2000 nits, which is eye-scorching, and this is 56% brighter than the U27G4XM. In real scene brightness, the M27P6 puts up an excellent showing, with its tendency to favour brightness on show. Relative to the other 4K mini LED monitors, low APL brightness is higher, somewhere around 10 to 15% above the MSI and AOC models. Mid APL brightness is even better, with a 50% advantage in some tests. This meant that on average, across our 8 tests, the KTC model was 18% brighter than the MSI and 29% brighter than the AOC. In most circumstances, it gets much brighter than an OLED as well, which is the key advantage of mini LED LCDs. In terms of contrast, the M27P6 is okay in best case scenarios, achieving around 130,000 to 1, which is fine for HDR, though short of the best HDR capable LCDs, which typically use VA panels. When we have bright and dark elements close together, the KTC model puts up the weakest numbers of the 3 models we've been focusing on, which is indicative of its bias towards brightness instead of contrast, though in general, it's not a massive difference. The MSI model is about 15% better in this test, and all the IPS LCDs get smoked by the VA LCDs with greater local contrast figures assisting in HDR content as well. Checkerboard results are even weaker, and again this is due to the way the backlight is being controlled. While the AOC U27G4XM isn't nearly as bright as the M27P6, in difficult contrast scenarios like this test, it produces a 75% higher contrast output. HDR accuracy is okay in dark scenes, we're getting a mid-table result which is fine. Bright scene results also mid-table, so HDR EOTF accuracy is pretty much average here. Color match performance is very good though, so the overall saturation and HDR color experience is decently accurate. Color volume is very high as well, owing to an outstanding level of peak brightness and wide color gamut enabled by the quantum dot enhanced backlight. KTC do a good job of advertising the specs of this product. The only potentially misleading aspect is how sub-2 delta E accuracy is advertised, while in our testing it missed the mark for proper calibration and of course the usual response time BS. The concerns I have here are more related to the design, which I mentioned earlier, including unrealistic bezels seen across their marketing images and one image showing a non-existent LED element. The name KTC M27P6 is average as far as monitor names go. The good thing about it is it's short, but it's not especially memorable. My main concern is that KTC sell 2 products with very similar names that only differ by a single letter in the middle of the name. There's both an M27P6 and an M27T6, the T model referring to a 1440p screen instead. In the feature support matrix, we see a good showing, especially in the port selection as we get USB-C and a KVM switch. There's a couple of borderline results here. Of course, 240Hz is only accessible in the 1080p mode. The sRGB mode has partially unlocked settings, and there's sort of a single overdrive mode experience in the 4K mode. I've also flagged one firmware issue, which is that every time you go to change the brightness, it warns you about power consumption, even if you've already dismissed the message, which is pretty annoying. Not a major issue, but something that is usually only displayed once on other products. With all the testing now in the bag, it's been great to check out a monitor from a brand that we haven't evaluated before. I had no idea going to this one whether a KTC monitor would be something potentially worth recommending. But I think the M27P6 is a pretty good 27-inch 4K mini LED LCD for gaming, and depending on your preferences and how pricing shapes up, I think it's a product worth buying. The main star of the show here is the combination of the 4K 160Hz IPS LCD panel with a 1152 zone mini LED backlight. This seems to be a popular new panel in the second half of 2025, as this is now the 3rd display I've tested with very similar specs. It's interesting how each manufacturer has a slightly different take on how to optimize this panel. KTC in particular have chosen to pump out brightness, making this the brightest version I've tested and one of the overall brightest LCDs you can get. This can lead to stunning HDR image quality in the right situations, especially anything that displays high levels of brightness, as this monitor easily reaches over 1500 nits. But HDR isn't just about brightness, and with its decent zone backlight, contrast is pretty good on this display too, allowing for deep blacks alongside bright highlights. There are trade-offs compared to the other models we've tested. With higher brightness comes a higher chance of blooming on this IPS LCD, but this isn't a huge concern, and for the most part I think it looks great. While this is a solid HDR LCD, it's important to remember the hardware at hand is mid-tier in 2025. VA LCDs take things a step further, with a higher native contrast ratio offering even greater control, but opting for IPS does have its strengths. Viewing angles are notably better than VA LCDs, and transition times are faster, leading to better motion performance. In its 4K mode, the M27P6 has pretty good response time tuning, especially for the middle part of the refresh rate range, getting closer to offering a single overdrive mode experience than other similar models. It doesn't really offer variable overdrive, but this doesn't seem to matter much, as the performance bounce offered here is good regardless. There's also a 1080p 320Hz dual mode configuration, which isn't as well tuned, though it does offer superior clarity than the 4K mode and is a great option for competitive gaming, extending the versatility of this display. There's a great port selection on offer, an ergonomic stand, and a similar feature set to other modern gaming monitors. The main downsides are that the SDR mode, while capable of extreme brightness, doesn't have the best factory calibration, and the build quality is average. The main competitors to the M27P6, at least of the products I've tested previously, are the AOC U27G4XM and MSI MPG274 URDFW E16M. All three appear to share the same panel hardware, but don't necessarily offer the same performance. The AOC and MSI models are more tuned for contrast in the HDR mode, whereas the KTC model is more tuned for brightness. If you personally prefer one aspect to image quality over the other, this may be the deciding factor between the KTC or the others. Outside of that, I tend to prefer the M27P6 over the U27G4XM, as it has a better port selection, better response time tuning at both 4K and 1080p, and better backlight strobing, although the AOC model has better color calibration. The MSI model is more similar to the M27P6. It's not quite as well tuned for response times, but offers better calibration and a few additional features and settings the KTC model doesn't have. It's a pretty close battle though between these three models. So ultimately, it really does come down to price. The KTC M27P6 has a current price of $470 US, though at some retailers it's listed for $500, which is the same price as the MSI model. That seems fair to me. It's not a mind-blowing great deal that makes me strongly prefer the KTC model, but it's fine given how it performs. I don't know what the U27G4XM will be priced at yet in the US, but its Australian price of $600 implies that it will be a bit cheaper than the MSI model and probably cheaper than this KTC as well. Again, that seems fair because in general the AOC model is not quite as good. There's simply no clear recommendation here. It will come down to pricing and availability in your region, as well as the things that you prefer in a monitor. So anyway, that's it for this review of the KTC M27P6. As I said, this is not a paid review or anything like that, so yeah, fully independent, all that sort of usual stuff. If you do want to support our independent testing here at Monitors Unboxed, please consider supporting us via our Patreon page. Links to that is in the description. If you sign up, you get access to some pretty cool benefits, the calibrated settings and ICC profiles for the monitors we review, as well as our Discord chat and other good stuff. So yeah, anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.